Dave, today in the huddle with us is Leigh Steinberg, just super well-known agent that kind of revolutionized the industry and really took what players are looking for in an agent to a new level, I think. And Leigh, it is so good to have you with us today, and we really appreciate you being part of Huddle Up with Gus.
It's my pleasure.
So Leigh, what we really like to start with is, when you were little, who was that person or what was that spark for you that got your interest and your love of sports?
Well, my father had played basketball and golf at UCLA, so I was raised a Bruin baby. And I used to see UCLA basketball and football. So that got me going, but he also loved the Dodgers. And when they moved to Los Angeles in 1958, they were packed with stars. And Sandy Koufax became my real idol, and I also loved Maury Wills. And then the second year they were here, they won the World Series. So we were all transcendent in our excitement. The Lakers at that point had Wilt Chamberlain and Jerry West and Elgin Baylor. And the Rams, my dad used to take me to the games. We sat so high in the Coliseum that you needed a telescope to see the field. But it made me fall in love with football. And so Los Angeles was replete with great sports teams, and I had UCLA to root for. So there was really no choice. I was going to be a hardcore sports fan. And back then we used to fight with each other to see who got to read the sports section in the newspaper first.
Yeah, Dave and I, we did a radio show this morning, and we just talked about how back in the day, the only way you got your sports was when Monday Night Football would come on at halftime, and you could find out about your team during the games, right, Dave?
Oh, yeah. I grew up a Steeler fan, but I was in Arizona, and the only time I ever saw the Steelers was Monday nights. But going along with that, newspaper, the Sunday sports page with all the stats was.
That's why, and that's why it makes it so significant that you guys fought over that, that sports page.
So what I did later in life is we formed a business because there was no internet. And if you were living in Los Angeles, but you were a Pittsburgh Steeler fan, we had a reporter from Pittsburgh supply all the highlights, all the features, everything. And today I'm on the board of a company called Digital Sports Network that does exactly the same thing. You can get 30 hours of high-def content. But then there was no way other than reading a box score that you could ever follow a team outside your market. And it would be really hard to describe the world that I grew up in with black and white television and 3 networks, and that was it. And there were not all the highlight shows. There was not the talk radio. There was no internet. So it was much more of a challenge to follow sports.
And I think it also kept the game kind of pure, too, right? With all the things that have happened to athletes, you would hear some of it, but now it's immediate. It's happens right now if somebody gets in trouble or whatever. Back then, it was just about the game and what their stats were. Now it's about everything else that goes on in their life as well.
Well, and it creates a unreal distortion of what athletes' lives are really like. Because if you have a couple thousand players who play in the NFL, 99.9% of them give peak performance. They go home to their wife and kids. They do charitable and community events. But the sports page takes those aberrations and pushes them into fans' faces. So you see every drunk driving, every domestic violence, as if somehow that was representative. Well, it's no more representative of the actual world of sports than watching your local news is, where you'd make the assumption that kidnappings and shootings are an everyday occurrence.
Right. No, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And that I wish was out of it, but we're never going back there again, I guess. So, Leigh, when you were young, you got to go. Did you have some siblings? How many people were in your family growing up?
I had two brothers, and we were all hardcore sports fans. My dad offered us $1 every time the shortstop Maury Wills hit a homer, which was never.
Right.
And but again, we had great teams, and it always interests me when people talk about the amazing heritage of other cities and diminished Los Angeles, but Southern California had a great football team. At the pro level, we have UCLA and SC. We had the Dodgers very quickly after that. We had the Angels, and it really is a sports mecca.
It really is. And
I mean, that was center of the universe for sports at that time.
oh, between the Lakers, the Dodgers. I mean, I think you guys even have hockey now. So you know the Kings have been
We
great.
don't have one now. We have two NFL teams, two NHL teams, two Major League Baseball teams, two soccer teams. Did I say two NBA teams, and UCLA and SC? So it's a sports cornucopia.
Yeah, it really is. And so when you were young, you were playing with your brothers. Who was your idol? Who was the guy you always wanted to be? You had so many people to choose from.
Oh, Sandy Koufax, because he was the best pitcher in baseball, and he was simply untouchable, and he carried himself in a very classy way. But I remember rooting for Jerry West when later I was negotiating with him for Byron Scott. I said, Jerry, this is really unfair. How am I supposed to negotiate in an aggressive way with someone whose picture was over my bed when I was a kid?
Right, right. So did you ever get to meet Sandy?
I did, and it was a real pleasure. And Maury Wills, who should be in the Hall of Fame, was also someone that I got to spend time with, and it was a complete thrill. Back then, we had transistor radios, and all of Southern California was united with the sound of Vin Scully's voice. And the Dodgers sold a unique concept, which was going to a Dodger game. So they marketed Los Angeles like it was Des Moines, Iowa, and they had straight A nights and Little League nights and Rotary nights. And so the concept was to go to Dodger Stadium and see the Dodgers play. It didn't matter who they were playing or who was pitching. You simply went, and it created a love affair which lasts to this day.
Right. So you're a young kid. You're going to all these games. You get to go and enjoy all these sports moments. When you go into high school, did you play sports? What were your sports in high school?
I ran track and cross country. I was smart enough to know I'd probably be a grease spot on a football field. Yeah. So I ran the mile, the 2 mile, and I ran cross country. Of course, we played every sport when we grew up. We weren't sitting there with video games. On a Saturday morning, your mom would let you out the front door, and all day long you would play baseball, basketball, football with all the kids around. And you had to do a funny thing. You had to use your imagination.
Right.
Instead of being swarmed over by big screen graphics and sound.
Well, ask him what sport you like to play when you were a kid.
Well, it's funny, Leigh. We were talking about this earlier today. Wiffle ball was for many of our guests so far on our show. Wiffle ball has always been like a big common denominator for kids when they're young. But always going out playing Saturday morning until dawn to dusk is. I mean, that's what we did, and it was
any corner, any field you could find, you went and played wiffle ball.
And we made games up. So that there was a game we made up called Porch Ball, where you took a tennis ball and you threw it against a porch, and then the ball would come back, and based on if you hit it at a right angle, you'd get a home run, but it was single, double, triple. So we'd make up games, and we had endless football games in the front yard. We had endless baseball games. We had endless basketball games, and we loved them all. The only thing we didn't have much of in Southern California was hockey, because in Southern California they would take you for a snow trip, and you would drive up to the mountains and you saw this incredible thing, which was snow, and you'd put it in a cup because you knew that you wanted to show your parents that this amazing thing, which was snow, which we'd never seen. And of course, it was a 2-hour bus ride to get back. So imagine what we showed our parents.
A cup of water.
Yeah, a cup of water. We feel that way about sun here in Pittsburgh. We don't get a lot of sun. We get more rain and snow. But
well, I know Pittsburgh well because for about 20 years I represented the Steeler quarterback. It started with Neil O'Donnell, and then it went to Cordell Stewart, and then I did like the first 5 years of Ben Roethlisberger.
Oh wow! So you've been here many times. What's your favorite place to visit in Pittsburgh?
Heinz Field.
Heinz Field. Do you have a restaurant that you always went to?
Oh gosh, we had so many. I can't remember. I had players like Plexico Burris. I had Carnell Lake, but there was that one Super Bowl where Neil O'Donnell started for Pittsburgh, and I represented all the quarterbacks on the field, all the Pittsburgh quarterbacks and all the Dallas quarterbacks. So the only sure thing was I was going to visit one very happy group and one very sad group.
Right. You knew whichever one won, that's the locker room you were going to, that's for sure.
No, I would go to the losers' locker room. Yeah. The other agents could go to the winners. I had to go where they needed me. And eventually I'd get to the winning quarterback, but and Troy won 3 of them, but so there was a period there where Troy won 3 and Steve Young won 1, so we were reigning Super Bowl MVPs.
So did you represent Jason Garrett as well?
I did.
Yeah.
Jason Garrett, Wade Wilson, Mike Tomczak, Cordell, Neil O'Donnell. I had all the quarterbacks in that game.
I think there's still discussion on the radio about a couple of O'Donnell's picks in that game. Where were they going? You know, it's like it's still discussed today, believe it or not. But,
I understand. Yeah. All I knew when I was watching that was he was about to be a free agent, and he would not get re-signed in Pittsburgh. He'd end up going somewhere else.
Made your job a little bit harder.
Yeah, but we ended up signing a good contract with the Jets.
Yes, you did. What high school did you go to?
I went to Hamilton High School, which is in West Los Angeles. It's very classic looking. It was close to MGM, so we had a whole group of child stars. And we also later had Al Michaels went there. Warren Moon went there. We had Sidney Wicks. We had a series of gifted athletes. It was probably 90% Jews and 10% blacks, and then we started winning.
Right. So you get through high school. You have a love of sports. When you were a junior, senior, what were your thoughts about what you really wanted to do? What was your next step? What was your plan?
So my dad raised me with 2 core values. One was to treasure relationships, especially family. And the second was to try to be an agent for change and make a difference in a positive way in the world and help people who couldn't help themselves. So I knew I was going to try to be someone that helped other people, and it probably would have been politics, but I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And my whole parents had 5 degrees between UCLA. And so I went to UCLA, and that was the first year of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but he was called Lou Alcindor then. I took a class called anthropology, and I was late. And I walked into the classroom, and all I could see in front of me, there was only one seat left, was a bunch of darkness, and I couldn't see the professor. And then at the end of the class, Lou Alcindor turned around and said, "I hope I didn't block your view." But the first demonstration I was ever in is SC was voted to go to the Rose Bowl instead of UCLA, even though we had a better record. And so we marched down Wilshire Boulevard in protest, got onto the 405 freeway, and shut down traffic. So Little did I know what was yet to come. But then I transferred to Berkeley because it was the late 60s and it was rock and roll and herbal substances and long hair and free love. And it was sort of the concentric capital of students in the world. And I went on to be student body president. Wow. At the same time, the governor was Ronald Reagan. So everything I learned about negotiating originally came from negotiating with Ronald Reagan. Every time we shut down the campus in protest over the Vietnam War, he intervened, and we had some really classic interactions. Later, he gave me a humanitarian award when he was in the White House, but it didn't seem all that cordial then.
Right. So you're in the 60s. It's some prolific music that came out of that era. Who was the band that you loved to listen to?
So the interesting thing about being student body president at Berkeley is there were visitors from all over who would come. And I actually ended up showing, Jimi Hendrix came by one day and I loved his music. And I showed him around Berkeley, and Jim Morrison came another day and I spent some time with them. So we were just coming out of the period of Motown, which we all loved. And then it was rock. So it was the Rolling Stones, it was the Beatles, it was Cream, it was Janis Joplin, it was the Jefferson Airplane, but it was the mecca for music. They used to have 3 bills over at the Fillmore in San Francisco that would be like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jefferson Airplane. So, we loved it all. And I had that experience before because my grandfather ran a place called Hillcrest Country Club. And Los Angeles Country Club wouldn't allow blacks, Latinos, Catholics, Jews, or actors. So my grandfather's club became the big hangout, and he would play gin rummy every day with a group that younger people won't remember, but it was Groucho Marx, George Burns, Jack Benny, George Burns, and my grandfather took me to my first baseball game. I have a picture sitting on Marilyn Monroe's lap. I have an autographed Elvis Presley guitar. So I had that experience when I was young, but again, Berkeley was the center of the world, and it was the center of rock music, and it was really joyful.
Did you ever think about maybe like entertainment law, not so much in sports, but in music?
I did, but the truth of the matter was I didn't want to know that a certain star was not as idyllic off the screen as he was on. I didn't want to know about the personalities. I loved movies. I was brought up as a movie fan, and I wanted to enjoy it for what it was. I wanted to enjoy television for what it was without knowing the behind the scenes and having that ruined somehow. But I wanted to be in court, so eventually I went to law school at Berkeley, and I wanted to be a district attorney. I had other offers in politics. I had offers in television news. But I was a dorm counselor in an undergraduate dorm, and they moved the freshman football team from Cal into the dorm, and one of the students was the quarterback, Steve Bartkowski. So when I graduated from law school, I had job offers in corporate litigation, and for the DA's office, I had a couple other offers. But before I ever got there, I had graduated in January 74, traveled the world for a year, and Bartkowski ended up being the very first player picked in the first round of the NFL draft in 1975. The draft was in January then, and he asked me to represent him. So there I was, brimming with legal experience, never having represented anyone, being a young lawyer. And the the World Football League was competing against the NFL.
Right.
And teams like the Shreveport Steamer and the Charlotte Hornets. And Bartkowski was a big blue-eyed blonde quarterback, and we ended up getting the largest rookie contract in NFL history. And I flew in the night before with Bartkowski to the airport, and I'd grown up in laid-back California. So we get into the airport, and there are Klieg lights flashing in the sky like for a movie premiere.
Right.
Huge crowd is pressed up against the police line, and the first thing we heard was, "We interrupt the late news to bring you a special news bulletin. Steve Bartkowski and his attorney have just arrived at the Atlanta airport. We switch you live for an in-depth interview." Oh my goodness. So I looked at him. Bartkowski probably believed that Dorothy looked at Toto when they got to Munchkinland, and I said, "I know we're not in Berkeley anymore." And I saw the tremendous idol worship and veneration that athletes were held in communities across the country, and I thought, they can be role models. And if they'll go back to the high school, the college, and professional community and set up charitable programs and enhance the quality of life, then I can really make a difference in this field. And so I didn't know if I'd keep doing it, but I saw that we could really have an impact off the field. And if I got into the heart and mind of a young athlete and listened carefully to what their values were and listened carefully to their ultimate aspirations, the biggest skill is listening. It's creating a climate of trust so that you can peel back the layers of the onion until you understand someone else's deepest anxieties and fears and their greatest hopes and dreams. And if you can bond emotionally at that point, then from helping establish someone as a role model to planting the seeds for second career to mentoring them throughout a career, I thought, well, this is sort of fun.
So I feel like all those things that you just talked about, I wish so many coaches would listen to that and try to do that with their players. Because I feel that's a big detriment for a lot of coaches. That they don't profile their players, they don't understand them.
So you mentioned profiling. So the second year I did this, I talked to every athlete I could, every football player I could, and I had reasonable results, but not great. And I figured out that if I could profile an athlete, see whether or not they had a good heart, see whether they wanted to be a role model, see if they were ambitious for second career, that I would have much better results. And so for the last 45 years, we've been trying to read everything we can, tried to make sure that our values match, make sure that someone kept economics in balance. And that's what allowed me to represent 62 first-round draft picks in football and the very first pick in the draft 8 different years, and then a big basketball practice, baseball, hockey. I did boxing with Lennox Lewis, the heavyweight champ, and Oscar De La Hoya, the middleweight champ, and Olympic athletes like Brian Boitano, the skater, and Kerry Strug, the gymnast. And the athletes in aggregate have raised close to $1 billion for charities.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's incredible. Leigh, what was the climate like with sports agents when you got into the business? Were athletes represented more by attorneys, or did they represent themselves, or what was that like? Most
of them represented themselves, or they had their parents do it. There was no guaranteed right of representation. So someone like Mike Brown in those early years, if I called him to represent a player, he would say, "We don't deal with agents," and slam the phone down.
Wow. I think they still do that.
So there really wasn't a well-developed field. There wasn't even a right to represent a player. And all that came later. So it was like the Wild Wild West. And you had agents going to college campuses offering money and cars and all sorts of things to players and signing them. And there was very little regulation. I mean, today, someone who wants to represent a football player has to be certified by the National Football League Players Association, has to take a test, has to undergo a background screening. States have laws where agents have to register. And the states of Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, and Texas have all sent agents to jail And then you have compliance on a college campus. So there is a large amount of regulation today, which cleans up the field, but none of that existed back then.
Yeah, no, it would have to be hard. Dave, I probably would have never played 1 year in the league if my dad had to negotiate my contract. There would have been so many F-bombs that he was an old mill guy from Pittsburgh. I don't think the coach would have kicked us both out.
That reminds me of a story. So I was negotiating with the Raiders back in 1976 for their second-round draft pick, a quarterback, Jeb Blount. And his father was a federal judge. And he wanted to be part of the negotiation. So I said, you understand this is your son. It might not be the best idea because the team's going to say something to denigrate his talents, and you're not going to be happy. He said, oh, I'm a federal judge. I can handle this. So the negotiator for the Raiders was a diminutive figure named Al Locasal, good guy. And at one point, he started saying, well, there was a vote. 8 people wanted to draft the place kicker, Chris Barr. Only 1 wanted Jeb Blount, and that was Al Davis. And all of a sudden, I could see the veins descending from Pepe Blount's neck. And he reaches over and starts strangling the negotiator for the Raiders. So ever since then, I've been really careful not to have athletes or their parents actually on the scene.
Oh, that's a great story. Yeah, my dad, he used to film our high school football games, and my wife's father was my high school football coach. And so he said, we're going to watch Saturday film, and, after Friday night, we're going to watch the film. And he said, let's turn the volume up and see what your dad was saying. The first word that comes out is the F-bomb, and he goes, oh, I don't think we're ever going to listen to that again. But that was just my dad. He's very passionate.
I gotcha. I've dealt with fathers forever. The very first negotiation I did with Steve Bartkowski, I said, look, the team is going to say some things to defend their position, so they might say that you're a little slow or you've got a bad back or you were just the best player available, but you aren't really the first pick. And I said, what do you want to hear from the negotiation? I said, oh, I want to hear everything. So I told him what the team had said. And he said, get me traded. That was never something I did again.
Right.
I got to the bottom line.
Like when did things really start rolling for you, though, Leigh? Like you have Bartkowski, and then did you slowly get momentum off of that? Or?
So I next signed Dave Hampton, who was a Pro Bowl running back, but it became clear that the quarterback position was by so far the most dominant position in football, and that it had much higher name recognition, that it offered the opportunity for role modeling, endorsements, a much longer career, higher pay, that I started signing quarterbacks. So in the 1983 draft, I had Ken O'Brien and Tony Eason in the first round, and I'd signed Neil Lomax. 1978, I signed Warren Moon, and he went up to Canada. And so I started aggregating Eric Hipple and Scott Bruner and a whole series of quarterbacks. So things were very successful. 1981, I had the 4th pick in the first round, who was Kenny Easley, who just went in the Hall of Fame. But in 1984, Warren Moon came back from Canada, and he was the first free agent that was at the peak of his career at the critical quarterback position, and all the team had to do was sign him. They didn't have to give up anything. And so we organized a tour, and 3 leagues were competing then, the USFL, the NFL, and the CFL. And we took a big trip across the country, which was a tour, and visited Houston, where Bud Adams said, you can have one of those oil wells if you sign here. And we went out to New Orleans, and John Meekum said, you see that skyline, you can own it all. And then to Tampa, where Hugh Culverhouse said, you can have a whole floor on the Tampa Sphere. And Warren ended up signing the biggest contract in the history of football. That was followed about 2 weeks later by Steve Young, who was the object of a fight between the USFL and the NFL, signing the biggest contract in history of sports, which was for $42 million. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot now, but that was made headlines. It was Dan Rather led the nightly news off with sports economics run amok, and it was on the front page of every paper in the country and all around the world. So the combination of those two really got things going. And in baseball, I had Carney Lansford, who was the American League batting champion, and we started to sign baseball players, and that practice grew to 61. But in football, it set off a trend. And then in 1989, 5 years later, I represented Troy Aikman, who was the first overall pick in the draft. And then the next year, Jeff George was the first overall pick. And the next year, Russell Maryland was the first overall pick. And then he skipped a year. And then in 1993, Drew Bledsoe was the first pick. And then in 1994, it was Dan Wilkinson. In 1995, it was Kajana Carter. And at that point, I'm representing half the starting quarterbacks in the NFL. And we have, and I would say it was pretty dominant.
Well, yeah, it's just an amazing story. And you probably just walked in a room. I mean, I wouldn't, if you would have came and visited me, I'm sure it would have been, surely, come on, let's go do this thing. But because you've worked so hard at it and you put so much effort in, because my question is, when you have somebody like Warren Moon and Steve Young, how do you know where to start? Because you have to do a lot of research on what that value should be, because it's going up every year.
So back then, there was no salary cap. So the question became, whose reality was going to prevail? Could I paint a picture through statistics, through comparables, that would show the value of the quarterback or any other player? Because, I mean, we now have our 10th player just went into the Hall of Fame over the weekend, Tony Gonzalez, but I also have Derek Thomas and Thurman Thomas and Bruce Smith and Howie Long and Kevin Green and Kenny Easley and the three quarterbacks we talked about. So it was all positions. Could you make a compelling argument? Could you get into the heart and mind of an owner or a general manager and convince him that Aikman's deal was going to be the biggest contract of all time for a rookie? But you know what? This will demonstrate to the fans of Dallas that you're serious about bringing back winning football. And whatever we negotiate in a couple of years will be passé, because TV money will have jumped. One of the things, and so you have to make that compelling argument, and you only have a general manager or an owner to listen. So I learned that publicly negotiating didn't make any sense. And I went to owners and I said, we're not doing this the right way. Because when we have acrimonious negotiations that paint a player as greedy and a team as obstinate, we're just pushing fans away who can't relate to the money anyway. Right. And if we have collective bargaining agreements that pit billionaires against millionaires, and we have lockouts and holdouts, we're sabotaging our own sport. Our real competition in football is with Major League Baseball, the NBA, Walt Disney World, home box office, and every other form of discretionary entertainment spending. So why don't we get together and build the brand? Let's blow out TV contracts. Let's create stadia that have multiple ancillary revenue streams. When the internet came along, let's think about that. How about an NFL network? And I worked in harmony with owners to try to create a bigger pie, because I knew that the best way to handsomely compensate players was to make sure that there was enough money there. And the TV contract, which the year I started had $2 million as its share of the national TV contract for every team, then went to $17 million. And the owners thought the sky was falling, and they better lock that contract down. But Rupert Murdoch walked up to me at Fox and said, I'd like to bid on NFL football. We did a Super Bowl party at his Fox studio on the set of Hello Dolly. Anyway, they started bidding, and then 17 went to 40, went to 70, went to 100, and now it's $200 million. But the point is, the only way I could convince someone that our perception of value was correct was to show them why it was in their interest. So again, I emphasize that listening is really critical. Understanding the position you're putting the other person in, and then knowing better than to ever brag about a deal or to make the owner or the GM look bad. Because the only thing I can tell you is that if you step your foot on someone's exposed neck, you'll be vulnerable at some point later.
Right.
Leigh, what's the biggest difference in your opinion between negotiating a baseball contract and a football contract?
The systems are totally different. So in football, traditionally, a player will get a signing bonus, and this year they ranged from like $23, $24 million in the first round to about $5 million. Because the contracts have not been guaranteed. Now, last year, the top 22 players in the first round got totally guaranteed contracts for skill and injury. So it's starting to spread. The rest of the players in the first round got 3 years totally guaranteed for skill and injury, one not. And at the top of the second round, 2 plus 2. But because baseball contracts were not guaranteed, neither were basketball contracts. The fight was over the total compensation. So baseball has a system where it's all age-based. When a player gets drafted, comes in, signs a contract, if he's a first-rounder, he's going to get a little bit of bonus. But then the next 3 years, once they make the majors, the team can renew them for any figure that they want, as long as it's the minimum. And it's not till year 4 that they get salary arbitration. So the first 6 years of a player's career, the team has all the power in baseball. And that's why free agency operates the way it does. In football, the big fight was over the bonus and the length of the contract, because traditionally the contracts weren't guaranteed. So now we have a salary cap that's taken all of that away, because we busted the salary cap in '93 with Drew Bledsoe. They meant it to take away all bonuses, but Bledsoe made $20 million in his first 3 years because we did something called voidable years, where he got the big bonus, and then 3 years later he would become a free agent, or in Wilkinson's case, 4 years later. But at any rate, the point is that in football, the team has all the leverage. And when you see these players holding out of camp, the rules are stacked against them. So not that anybody's all that excited about the running backs holding out of camp. I mean, nobody wants to get the running backs hit in preseason, in the games, or in training camp anyway. So if they were in camp, they wouldn't be doing much. So, but the rules are all very heavily stacked against veteran players who hold out on contracts. Free agency produces players that are B+ to A- players generally. It doesn't produce the big superstars because they're either preemptively signed or they are franchised, and the team holds that franchise right. So in free agency, B+ players get A+ contracts because they have the benefit of competition, unlike basketball and baseball, where they really have competitive bidding, and it results in extraordinary contracts.
Yeah, baseball is crazy. Was it a $450 million contract this year?
Yes, but I will tell you this. With Russell Wilson at $34 million a year, and more contracts coming for the Jared Goffs of the world, and I might have a client who someone wants to talk to before his contract's up.
Maybe.
in Patrick Mahomes. But the quarterback position is now getting paid at a comparative level.
It really is, finally. You know what's crazy though, Leigh, is I was considered a backup for most of my career, and I still played in 15 years, 120 games, and the drop off though from starter to backup is so significant, and I always felt like the teams didn't put enough into a backup because for me, I could go in and play and have no problem staying at the level, but a lot of teams that we see when backups come in, the level drops off and the team has no chance.
So what's happening now, I think, defies rationality. Back in the day, Steve Young backed up Joe Montana. Imagine that as your roster.
Right.
And Steve Young made the fifth most amount of money of any player in the NFL as a backup. And you had at Washington Jay Schrader and Doug Williams, and you had at Minnesota Rich Gannon and Wade Wilson. So teams actually had high quality. In other words, Gus Frerotte would start for a lot of teams. Okay, so it was like having two starting quarterbacks. Now, because of the salary cap and the extraordinary amount of cap space that the quarterback contract takes up, it's a massive drop-off. And even more strange, and it's true at every position. So you lose your offensive tackle and you're not backed up by an A- or B+ tackle. You might be backed up by an aging veteran or a young rookie making the minimum. So we have income inequality at the NFL level with a large number of players making the minimum to support the salaries for 6 or 7 superstars. And what's even less rational to me is the fact that half the teams are only keeping 2 quarterbacks. So if it's the most critical position in a quarterback-centric game, how is it possible that a team would not have a quality second quarterback almost as good as the first one to pilot the team? I mean, it doesn't escape notice that having Nick Foles at Philadelphia saved them in 2 years and got them to the Super Bowl.
Right.
So that's crazy. So imagine this. Quarterback 1 goes down, and now you have quarterback 2 on the roster. Hopefully you have a quarterback on practice squad, but you may be out on the street looking for someone who hasn't even been in training camp. That is not a safe way to play NFL football.
Right. No, I agree. All right. So, Leigh, on a lighter note, obviously the movie Jerry Maguire came out, and, there's a lot of stuff. I haven't seen a lot of how you were involved in that. Did they talk to you a lot about that movie and get ideas about, your life? And can we incorporate this into the movie? I've never gotten to hear anything about that with you.
So in 1993, the writer-director Cameron Crowe called me up and asked if he could follow me and be immersed in the scene so that he could write a movie about a sports agent. And he really followed me for about a year and a half. And he went to the 1993 draft where I had Drew Bledsoe as a client, then flew up to the press conference with Bill Parcells. He went to a number of games with me, came to Pro Scouting Day at USC. He went to Super Bowl parties with me. I took him out to the league meetings in 1993 where I had Tim McDonald as a free agent. I was showing off to people and introduced him to people, but I told him stories, lots and lots of stories.
Right.
So he went off and created a brilliant script, and my job was sort of to vet the script to make sure that the willing suspension of disbelief that holds you in a motion picture. So as a sports fan, you know that the look is right, the dialogue's not phony. And then he assigned me some actors to put into role. One of them was Cuba Gooding Jr., who I took down to the Super Bowl in Phoenix in 1995 or 6. And and made him pretend he was a client all week. So he had to get in role, and he hung out with Desmond Howard and some of our other wide receivers. I actually had to show the quarterback in the film, Cush,
Right.
played by Jerry O'Connell, how to throw a spiral because he had gone to NYU and they didn't have football there. So, there's a lot of life there up on the screen. It's obviously not biographical because it's not a very good
Right.
movie for Jerry Maguire to start with the first pick in the draft.
Right.
You have to have uplift. But, I was on set for a lot of the time, and so there's a lot of life up on that screen. I always agreed with Cameron that I would never reference what might have come from me or what didn't. But and then every day since then, if I go to an airport or if I go out to dinner, inevitably someone's going to come up and say those four iconic words to me.
Yep. Show me the money.
Yeah. So it's been sort of funny. Show Me the Money actually came from the league meetings that year. Tim McDonald was a free agent. Nobody had any rights to him, so I was showing him off to teams. So Cameron went upstairs in Tim's hotel room, and Lou Dobbs and Moneyline on CNN was on the television. And Cameron asked Tim, what is it you're looking for in this experience? And Tim said, well, I'm looking for someone to show me winning because I've never had it. I'm looking for someone to show me respect, and I'm looking for someone to show me the money.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's awesome. That is a great story. Thanks for sharing that.
You got to listen to your podcast to find these things out.
That's right. That's right. And so, Leigh, so you're going on in your life, you're getting into the 2000s now. All those guys that you've talked about, they're considered old school now, right? And so you've had to adjust and transition and change with all these different types of athletes that are coming out. How have you stayed so current so these guys know who you are?
So I've spoken on 83 college campuses. So I made a decision I'd try to mentor the next generation of young sports professionals. And right now we have a agent academy that we do for younger agents that we've done about 15 times, teaching them specific skills, how to recruit, how to negotiate, how to do a charitable foundation, damage control. We've have an online course and a sports career conference that'll next come up in Chicago next month. But I went back to the campuses because I thought I'd share what I knew with the massive amount of people trying to get into the industry. So that was part of it. The second thing is I learned early. Back in the 90s, I created a company called Athlete Direct. And it put athletes up on the internet for the first time. You still had to reference AOL to get up onto the internet. And I signed Ken Griffey Jr., Michael Jordan, and a whole series of football quarterbacks. And for the first time, they were online. And for the first time, you could read their weekly diaries. You could do a chat with them. And I designed an e-commerce application. So part of it was in understanding that the new mode of communication was going to be the internet. And watching young people, because I had kids of my own who were reading news off the internet, who were getting entertainment off the internet. And then with the development of cell phones, that they were using that platform, iPads, all sorts of, and computers to communicate. So we got pretty active on that with the website and so on Twitter and LinkedIn. Like on LinkedIn, I have 76,000 buddies, friends. I made sure that I understood what that next generation was doing, and I also understood that if you multitask as a young person, and you're texting and Snapchatting and tweeting and watching little bursts of color and sound, it is undercuts attention span.
Right.
So I had to learn how to get a pitch out much quicker.
Yeah, the elevator pitch. Yeah, definitely.
Right. So you just had to understand that you were dealing with a new generation of millennials and all the rest. And it helped that in 2004, I had my second best-selling book, which was The Agent. And I traveled across the country to campuses in different places to make sure that that I was connecting with that next generation.
Now, also, today's athletes probably much more informed than they were, say, 25 years ago, 20 years ago. So how does that play in terms of courting them initially as an agent and during a negotiation process? They probably know a lot more than they did maybe in 1983.
Except history.
Except history.
So history began today for young people.
Right.
And so you had to make sure that the cultural references became relevant, right? That you knew that Ninja was playing Fortnite on, and that 110,000 people were watching him play that video game. They weren't playing the video game. They were watching him play the video game. And he has the highest recognition of any athlete, in the country. You had to understand that what young people were watching, what movies they were seeing, what they were listening to. So I made it policy to read 6 newspapers a day, a bunch of magazines, to sort of monitor television and music and stay up on what was happening. Now, I'm not going to go do a soul shake or hang out at a bar with a young person today.
Right.
We have Chris Cabot and my son Matt Steinberg. We have a whole group of people that can do that, but at least I had to make sure that I wasn't sitting on a bench with mismatched Madras shorts and black socks with my button up to the top, with drool coming out of the side of my mouth.
Probably not throwing out Barkowski's name when courting Mahomes. Leave that out of the conversation.
The only relevant thing was that I know how to elevate a player to the top of the draft.
Right. There's no doubt about that. So, Leigh, you've been through all these transitions in your life. You've done an amazing job, and you've talked about giving back now and doing things to help everybody else around you. And I think you're doing an amazing, amazing job of that. And just from people that want to be like you to the players that want to hire you, it's so amazing where you've come. What is something that you can tell our fans to give them an idea of just how to stay relevant for so long and what you've done?
So I think that, first of all, that you have to have a sense that one person can make a difference. My dad used to say to me, when you look for the amorphous they to fix a problem, when you think that other people are going to do it, politicians, older people, you could wait forever. And he'd look at me and say, the they is you, son. You are the they. So it's a sense of responsibility and understanding what's happening in the world that I created a program against bullying that took older athletes, put them with high school athletes so that they would change the culture of the school, because the athlete was on the top of the food chain, and if they're preaching tolerance, it's having Lennox Lewis cut a public service announcement that said real men don't hit women to address domestic violence. It's using athletes to raise awareness about climate change. And then my own projects. We set up a project with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, which is called Adopt a Minefield, and she and I announced it, and this would allow demining of minefields around the world. Today, I'm really concerned with the whole specter of concussion. So I just agreed to sit on a board of a group raising large amounts of money for Alzheimer's, CTE, and dementia research. Because I didn't think it was responsible to say that I had players' best fiduciary responsibility in mind and send them down the road to dementia. So I've done 14 concussion conferences trying to promote safer helmets, football without blocking and tackling during training camp, nutraceuticals and pharmaceuticals that can heal. So it's staying tuned to what's happening in the world and understanding that all of us can make a difference in our own way. For some people, it's simply good parenting. But we all have the obligation and responsibility to try to, heal suffering and help people who can't help themselves.
Right. So Dave, Leigh does he has a panel every year for his Super Bowl party, and I sat in that panel 2 years ago when it was in Minnesota and spoke about our app Roberto, which you're part of, and really how it's so important to use it as a proactive tool, Leigh. The Roberto app is basically a way to measure and monitor your brain performance. Because as you know, as you can see in how healthy he is, he'd probably do really well on it. But it's so important to keep up on your numbers. So what Roberto does is gives you an idea of where you are, and you got to stay within that normal range. And
well, that's an example of Gus Farrat and other people taking on a problem and coming up with an interesting solution that really helps athletes.
And that's what it's all about. It helps everyone. And we're really excited to be a part of that. So, Leigh, I really appreciate you coming on with us. One last thing we do before we go here, we do something called the No Huddle. And we fire a bunch of questions at you and answer them as quick as you want. But it's a lot of fun. We try to give you some questions maybe you haven't had before, but I doubt. But we really appreciate the time. So, Dave, why don't you fire away in the No Huddle?
All right, Leigh. In your opinion, what's the most overhyped thing in sports today?
The home run contest in baseball.
Well, it ruined our hitter, right? Josh Bell.
Josh Bell he's hitting about 150 since he entered that. So yeah, we're against that.
So Leigh, what is one? You've had over 300 athletes. Who is one athlete you think back and say, "Man, I just wish I could have represented him because I think I could have changed his life"?
Oh my goodness! Why don't we start with Johnny Manziel?
That's a good one.
And work our way on. Of course, I have a long list of the people I didn't take as clients, and of course, they've all gone on to be major superstars. I wish that I had been involved with the iconic athletes of our time and gotten them to use their brand, Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan, to use their brand for international good.
All right, Leigh, if you could go back in time and talk to a young Leigh Steinberg, what would you say to him?
I would say, beware of alcohol. Because when I had a crash from alcohol back 10 years ago, I didn't understand the addictive quality of it, and I hadn't been a big drinker, but boy, it caught up fast.
But you know what? You've done such a good job of saying, look, this is a bump in the road. You overcame it, and you're back on top again.
I think that if we share, the reason I've shared my own struggles is in the hope it helps somebody who's out there struggling and hopeless and give them some direction.
Okay, Leigh, if you were building a negotiator from scratch, what would their first quality be?
A quiet mind, the ability to tune out exterior stimulus, the ability to stay focused and stay in the moment and to elevate their level of discourse in negative or seemingly hopeless situations. So it's resilience, coming back over and over again, getting knocked back, but coming back over and over again.
So you don't want to reach across the table when the veins are popping out and start strangling the guy you're negotiating with. Is that what you're saying?
Excellent time to take a break.
So, Leigh, what's your biggest pet peeve? You got to have a big pet peeve.
People looking at their phones constantly, knocking you over as you try to enter the gym, looking at that phone and not being aware of what is happening. Did nuclear war just break out? Is your father on his deathbed? What could be so critically important on that phone that it steals you away from being aware of your environment and interacting with other people?
I share that with Leigh. That's my number one.
Oh, yeah. Well, you never have your phone on you.
Yeah, I prefer to. I wish they were never invented, quite frankly. But.
Well, look at Rocky Blyer. When we interviewed Rocky, we said, "How did you find out you were drafted?" He said, "All my friends told me they saw it on TV." He had no idea.
I remember in 1980 sitting with offensive tackle Brad Buddy, and the only way we could follow it was by radio, and then by the phone call he got. I mean, when you look at the draft today, which is a 3-ring circus, it's amazing.
It is crazy. All right, Dave, last one. What do you got for me?
Okay, what's the best innovation in sports in the last 20 years?
High definition TV, and the fact that you can actually see everything clearly. When you go back and look at the old non-HD TV, you can hardly manage to focus. So every development on television has football grew up with television, and it's part of what's made it the nation's most dominant sport.
What's your opinion on instant replay and where that's gone?
I think it's horrible. I don't think we need it. We've always had referees and umpires who use their own judgment. You can see on a baseball game that the umpire's not calling a strike, or he's calling the wrong thing. So here's what instant replay does to football. It creates more dead time, and it separates the thrill of a player scoring a touchdown from your emotional reaction to it. So now you have to wait and see, was it really a touchdown? Was it really a call? What was it really? Now, if you're at the stadium, all that's there is dead time. Nothing's happening. And if you're sitting at home, you're watching commercials or that ever compelling close-up of the referee with his headphones on.
Yeah, he's under the tarp.
We don't need it. It slows down football. It's a real threat to the millennial generation who we're going to have to keep in their seats anyway. And it's always been fun arguing about bad calls, and they don't get it right anyway because there's no certainty other than if you extend the yard marker on the 1st and 10 or on the goal line, there's no certainty anyway. So this is not science. This is not physics. It's a game played by people. And referees who missed a call would then come back. And fans love arguing over missed calls. So it was part of the game.
Oh, none bigger than in New Orleans last year, right?
Right.
I mean,
and so, yeah, but you have instant replay. How does that help?
I think a robotic strike zone would be a nightmare. It would just...
Oh, you can't do that. There's no way you can do that. I mean, the strike zone is what it is. Everybody has a different day. Some days it's real tight. Some days it's out wider.
I watched the Dodger game last night, and you could see that the ball was a ball, but they called it a strike. And so I don't know how the umpires ever let that happen because it shows their fallibility every single day.
Also, holding the tag on a runner slides into second, and they hold the tag for 3 seconds in case he stumbles. Hate that also. That's another one.
Oh, and then you get to watch the umpires, watch it 17 times with different angles. And even with all those angles, it's still not completely clear.
Right. It just takes way too long. It takes way too long. Well, Leigh, I think we need...
No replay.
Yeah, no replay. But I think we would need another 6 hours to get through everything about Leigh. But we really appreciate you sharing and taking the time with us.